Traditionally, Imbolc is celebrated on February 1st or maybe 2nd for some people, although some pagans might choose to reckon the date by the moon in some way, which is fine. Some people see it more as a date, others as a season. Imbolc means something like in the bag or in the belly, and probably refers to the time when the earliest lambs would be born, which in turn meant that people would have milk to see them through the time of year when stores of grain and preserved meat began to run low. Definitely something to celebrate. There are many names for the goddess Brigid and the later saint. Different countries have their own versions of these names, as did Celtic people in various times and places. That makes it impossible for me to offer you one definitive pronunciation. In modern Irish, it's Breed. But one also hears Brigid and even Bridget. In Scottish Gaelic, it's mostly Brige or Brige, depending on the dialect, and in Lowland Scots, people call her Bride, although you may hear any of the Irish pronunciations I just mentioned too. The name seems to mean high one, but exactly in what sense is more difficult to discern. It could mean a goddess that the people consider to be the top goddess, or a goddess that people lift up on high out of reverence and esteem. It could mean a goddess of a high place, hills, mountains, even hill forts. Or it could mean goddess of the people of high places, who either name themselves after her, or give her their tribal name. We're the people of the high places, and this is our goddess. Take your pick. What follows is my story of the history of Brigid. It's based on historical evidence, but the way I've connected the pieces of evidence is ultimately my own, and I can't swear to you that it's correct as a linear narrative. Even if it's not, I think it's a useful way to draw the different strands of her story together in order to see them as a whole. So this is my story of Brigid. Sometime around 1500 BC, there was a Celtic tribe in western Austria, in the Alps, called the Briganti or Briganti. They left some inscriptions to a goddess with a Brige-like name, Brigando or Brigindu. Certainly they lived in a high place, the Alps, so it doesn't really clarify the name stuff any further. The Briganti, like neighboring Celtic tribes, were badly subjugated by the Romans during the last few decades BC. As you can see from the map, there were some Briganti in France, too. This is where it gets interesting, because within a century, the Romans tell us that there was a tribe called the Brigantes in what is now northern England. There's no direct evidence that these are the same people, or that their goddess, called Brigantia, is definitely the same goddess, but it's a strong possibility. If you're wondering why we can't be sure about this, it's because these people also lived in a high place, this time the Pennines, which are a range of hills which are the highest thing in their area. I've only put a few pins in the British map, but there are reports of Brigantes in many parts of the north, and even in North Wales. We also find rivers which appear to be named after the same goddess further south, the River Brent in Wales and the River Brent in England, for example. The Romans wrote about the Celtic gods, both on the continent and in Britain, but unfortunately they always tried to conflate them with their own gods, and didn't tell us what names the Celts used. We think they were talking about Brige, etc., when they wrote about the Celtic Minerva. The Romans associated this Minerva with arts and crafts, healing springs like the one at Bath. By the 2nd century AD, the Greek geographer Ptolemy says that there are people called Brigantes in Ireland, and he places them in the southeast part of the country, around Wexford, Waterford, and Kilkenny. If we jump forward to the 9th century, Cormac's Glossary, which was a sort of early Irish dictionary, refers to Brige as a goddess and as daughter of the Dagda. He says she's expert in poetry and learning, with two sisters, also called Brede. One Brede is associated with healing, and the other with smithcraft. The story of the Second Battle of Moytuira associates her with magical livestock. The king of rams, the king of bulls, and the king of boars all belong to her. In this story, she's married to Bresh, who's the king of the Tuatha De Danann for a while. even though his father is from the enemy tribe, known as the Fomorians. Brigid and Bress have a son called Rören, who is fighting on the enemy side, and who is killed by the Tuatha smith, Goivnu. Brigid is so sad that she starts wailing with grief, which the text says was the first time keening was heard in Ireland. Now, keening is a very specific, ritualized expression of grief, which used to be part of traditional Irish funerals. A few other Irish texts repeat bits of what I've just shared, but that's really all the information we have about the goddess Brigid. She doesn't have a lot of involved stories. So let's back up a bit and talk about Saint Brigid. A lot of folklorists and neo-pagans believe that at least some of the traditions associated with St. Brigid started with the goddess Brigid. There isn't much solid evidence for this, but it's entirely possible. Now, there are a few saints called Brigid or Brigid, but the one we're talking about is St. Brigid of Kildare. The word Kildare comes from the Irish Kildare. Kil means church or cell, like a monastic cell, and Dara refers to oak. The oak part has caused people to wonder whether there was a Druidic connection to the place before it was Christianized. St. Brigid is believed to have lived around the 5th century, but she isn't mentioned in writing until the 7th century. So to be clear, the mythology I mentioned earlier was written down later than this, but its origins may be earlier than this. It's not clear. It's also unclear whether there definitely was a historical person who became St. Brigid. Some of the early saints in many countries were kind of made up, it turns out. One thing we do know is that an important family, whose surname would be O'Dowling in English, became a force in Leinster in the 5th century. Now remember that all the places associated with the Brigantes lie in southern Leinster, with Kildare just a little bit to the north of them. Is there still a thread of connection here? Maybe. By the early 7th century, the Bishop of Kildare and the O'Dowling chief just happened to be brothers. In 650, the first hagiography, or Life of St. Brigid, appeared. Having a famously named, miracle-working popular saint associated with Kildare will have increased the wealth and status of the bishop and his church, and that of the surrounding area. So if St. Brigid was somehow created from the goddess, it may have been more about political gain than replacing the pagan with a Christian. According to Gerald of Wales, the nuns of Kildare kept an eternal flame, which certainly harks back to those Roman stories of Minerva's temple, but Gerald of Wales isn't known for sticking to the facts. Now, many Celtic saints' stories share elements with Celtic myth and folklore. It's probably a mistake to think that there was even a hard division between Christian beliefs, everyday customs, and pre-Christian beliefs. Now, some individuals, the more educated churchmen, for example, will have taken exception to mixing these things, but everyday people mostly took belief and custom for granted. So it's hard to tell whether some of St. Brigid's stories were borrowed from the goddess, or just typical of the way people thought at the time. We are told that she was born at sunrise, neither within nor outside a house, so in the doorway. That's a typical example of Celtic liminality right there. As a child, she would only drink the milk of a white cow with red ears. Otherworldly animals are often described in exactly the same way in Celtic tales. The house she's in appears to contain a blazing fire from outside, but it's not on fire. We learn that she and her mother were enslaved to a druid doing farm work, which gives the saint a little extra magical association. Many of St. Brigid's miracles had to do with agriculture and livestock, and she was also credited with turning water into beer. One story that might surprise you is about the famous Brigid's cross made from rushes or straw. The story runs that St. Patrick was trying to convert a pagan who was on his deathbed. Well, Patrick had tried everything, but the man refused, so Brigid said, "Let me try." She went to the man's bedside and started telling him the gospel, and she was making one of those crosses while she talked to him. And apparently that did the trick, and he took the sacrament. I have to admit, that story kind of put me off Brigid's crosses, But of course there are many other ideas about their origins. Besides making crosses, there are all kinds of customs associated with Imbolc. Alexander Carmichael collected many of these in his famous book called the Carmina Gadelica. Children, mostly girls, might make a doll dressed in white and adorned with baubles. She was called a brijag or a bujog in Ireland, and she was laid in a special basket known as a bride's bed or bride's bed and carried from house to house. There was a little ceremony about letting her into the house, and some songs went with this custom. In the Hebrides, women dug up wild carrots and tried to divine the identity or appearance of future lovers on Imbolc. An Irish custom involves hanging a cloth outside on Imbolc Eve, perhaps on a hedge or windowsill, where it's allowed to collect the dew. The cloth is then brought indoors and carefully allowed to dry. It's kept as a healing charm throughout the year, and it might be placed on the head to cure a headache, or on the belly of a woman in labor to help with the pain. These customs are almost endless in number, but I'll leave it there. I hope to have another video ready in just a few days, which will be about the relationship between Brigid and the Cailleach in Scottish folklore. If you enjoyed this video, one way you can support me is by buying my little book of Imbolc poetry. Most of the poems are about the traditions of Brigid and the Cailleach in Scottish folklore, and I think you'll find them uplifting and perhaps useful in your Imbolc devotions and rituals. I'll put a link below this video in case you'd like to get a copy. Thanks for listening.